think I'll start, if I may, by telling you just a little bit about my background. My background is in nursing, and then I diversified and I became involved with counselling and with complementary therapies. And through complementary therapies, partly I discovered healing, which I explored through spiritual healing, through Reiki, and through a type of healing called therapeutic touch. And it was therapeutic touch which I resonated with. So although for me there is just the one healing, whatever the modality, I have to describe it as therapeutic touch in a way, because that's the model that I'm at home with, which doesn't mean that it's no comment on any other types of healing. It's just the one that I personally am at home with. And I appreciate that there are probably healers in the room, and certainly people with a sort of spiritual pathway. So I hope you'll be open to my interpretation, my perceptions. So through counselling, through complementary therapies, I became involved with healing. And through a series of synchronicities, if you like, I found that I was in the right place at the right time in the early 1990s, and just happened to bump into the right people at the right time. And as a consequence, I was able to set up a complementary therapies and counselling service in our oncology department at our hospital in Ipswich. And I'm very proud that, along with one or two other people, we were called pioneers. Not that long ago, somebody who was doing a PhD research on how nursing got involved with complementary therapies and healing, and it peaked, there was a huge interest, and then it slid down again. Taken up by non-nurses, by therapists, by healers. Possibly that's how it should be. But we were referred to as the pioneers, and I felt quite proud of that. I think it might be helpful just to describe, for those of you that perhaps aren't familiar, and you may all be, I don't know, but an oncology department in a hospital is a busy place. We also worked on the ward. It was a whole unit with a ward for 29 patients, outpatients, a chemotherapy day unit, and a radiotherapy department. Busy, an increasing number over the years of patients who actually came as outpatients rather than inpatients. So the way we eventually set up the service was that we saw people by appointment. They were referred or self-referred. We saw them by appointment, and for, in theory, 6 sessions, but we were as flexible as we could be. And just again to give you an idea of the service, it started off with just me, and I did the counselling. At that time I did aromatherapy and I did therapeutic touch, and it grew, and we eventually got some funding from a local charity who paid for 3 or 4 therapists to work part-time. I was employed by the hospital. And I think this is important when we come to think about integration. Last March, I left the NHS. I retired from the NHS. And to replace me, I was very pleased. They replaced me with 2 people, but they actually, through the charity, although the charity contributed financially, they maintained the role, including somebody to lead on complementary therapies, as a substantive role, one that was paid for by the hospital. And I did have concerns that when I left, they may well let that money go somewhere else, but they kept it for the complementary therapies and the counselling, and I think that's a huge statement as to how it was valued by the staff and of course by the patients. So I hope that's given you a bit of a picture of so you can visualise in a way the stories that I'm going to tell you. And this book, I tried to write a book for quite a long time and I just couldn't get it at all. I felt I ought to. That I ought to put down. I just wasn't sure how to go about it. I tried this, I tried that, and I had written articles. I mean, I wasn't unfamiliar with writing, but it wouldn't come. And then suddenly, I remembered the phrase, a far-reaching thing, which is a phrase that the daughter of a patient used after I'd given healing, therapeutic touch, to her father. And I'll come back to that shortly. And I hope that with one or two of the other stories or tales that I'm going to share with you, that title will show itself again in the way that it is a far-reaching thing. It just doesn't touch the patient, if you like. It touches people around, which reminds me in a way that when I first started using it, there was, as you can imagine, we're going back 20 odd years, a huge amount of scepticism. But nurses would walk into the room and they'd go, oh, it feels really peaceful in here. Very interesting. I think as soon as I got the title, the book flowed. And I think from a personal point of view, I needed to write it because it was, for me in a way, a closure and an acknowledgement of the hundreds, if not, well, thousands of sessions, but hundreds and hundreds of people that I'd seen over the years and had worked with. And I'm sure those of you who do work with people who are troubled by illness or by trauma in their life, it's a very humbling experience, because regardless of whether of the effect that the healing may or may not have, people seem to have a huge inner resourcefulness, and I've always found that so humbling. And I felt that it was important just to acknowledge that. I also felt that I wanted to add to the discourse, if you like, on healing. I didn't want to do a how you do it book, although hopefully there is in the book a description of therapeutic touch or healing. I wanted to communicate its essence, if you like, by sharing the experiences of patients, of relatives, and of my own experiences, my own reflections, because I'm fascinated by the meaning that we attach to healing. I know we try to pinpoint how it works, if you like. We try to label it, we try to find a frame of reference for it. Certainly, although there's limited research, there is some research, as Tim's spoken about Sandy's, and there has been research before as well, that shows that it can initiate a change towards well-being. And with my particular modality, therapeutic touch, it was researched over the years by PhD students in America, in the States. And although not all of that research is robust, some of it did demonstrate that it can bring about a relaxation response and help to reduce anxiety. So although there is research, it's the anecdotal evidence, the quality of life experience, and also the meaning and that people or the meaning they find in it, I think, the meaning they find within it. And I hope that in the book that by reading it, people will pick up that very essence of healing, and that it will add to our understanding of it. Now, can I just ask, please, how many healers or of whatever denomination there are in the room? Okay, right. So, therapeutic touch is an interpretation of healing. Healing itself is something which we know goes back thousands of years, and the most common way it's described is historically is through the laying on of hands. The word healing comes from an Anglo-Saxon word meaning Harlan, or Harlan meaning healing, or meaning to make whole. To make whole. And I think, you might disagree with me, I might be wrong, but my sense is that in Anglo-Saxon times, the worldview was such that there was a sense of interconnectedness between nature, between people, between whatever people believed in, that there was a sense of being part of a greater whole. So when they talked about being whole, they didn't necessarily mean not having an illness. They meant feeling at one, being at one with the world and with themselves. And one of the first ladies that I used therapeutic touch with, a lady who'd got breast cancer, who knew that her condition was terminal, I did therapeutic touch with her, and I'll try and describe what that looks like shortly. And when I'd finished, she just said to me, she said, "I feel at ease with myself." And I thought that was a very similar way of describing what feeling at one with yourself, with the world, just feeling at one, not at peace necessarily, but at ease. And she also said, for a while I completely forgot that I had cancer. Now, I think to look at therapeutic touch, to observe it happening, you would see the practitioner, if you like, just moving their hands a few inches away from not their own body, but the patient's body, like this. And that's what it looks like. And I know that, for example, Reiki sometimes is hands-on. Spiritual healing quite often uses the chakras and rests over the chakras for a while. In therapeutic touch, we can do that, and we're certainly aware of the chakras, and we might incorporate that knowledge and that energy, if you like, into the process. But with therapeutic touch, when we're doing that, we are allowing ourselves to sense the pattern of energy as a whole. And it may be that that is actually all we're doing, but while we are in a state of what we call centeredness, and with our intention to help, and to help in whatever way is right for that person at that time, not with a prescriptive, we want to make this person feel better, we want their anger to go, we want this to happen, we want that to happen, but allowing whatever is right for that person. It's sometimes, and I rather like this, described as by using our intention, our compassion, and by being in a state of centered calm, and I'll talk about that later, we become like a tuning fork, and the patient or the client resonates with that tuning fork, the tuning fork being vibrating, if you like, at a healing vibration. And so we don't necessarily think in terms of channeling or exchanging, but being part of the process whereby there is a resonance between the giver and the receiver, for want of a better word, although it's more like creating a space where the vibration is of a healing vibration. So I hope that's given you a little bit of an idea. I tend to go off script, so
Can I just ask a question?
Yes, please do.
Why is it called therapeutic touch when you don't actually touch?
Yeah, I know.
Physically.
I agree, because actually when I first came across it was by accident. I was learning to do massage and aromatherapy, and I was looking for books on massage and saw a book called Therapeutic Touch by a lady called Janet McRae, and assumed it was about massage, and spent quite a long time not working out why it wasn't touching people. It was developed in the United States by an American professor of nursing, Dolores Krieger, and she felt that she had done some research with somebody to do with the laying on of hands. She worked very closely and lived with a woman called Dora Kunz, who some of you might have heard of. She was a spiritual healer. And Dolores, or Dee, who's still alive, felt that healing is a potential within all of us. So she felt she would teach it to her nursing students. And it's now taught, it's not confined to nursing students anymore. But she realised that healing had connotations that some people were very sceptical about. And she wanted also for it to be non-denominational. She wanted it to be neutral. And that's why she called it therapeutic touch. But I agree. It took me a while to work out why this book on what I thought was massage didn't actually touch. So that is why, and that's a little bit of the history of therapeutic touch. I would like to sort of start telling you, or sharing with you, a story, a tale if you like, about the patient after whom the book is named. And obviously the names are changed, and the name I may use may not be the name that's in the book, because I shall just make up a name. But, and if I could find my glasses, I'd actually read a bit. Aha, here we go. The background to this story is actually that the day that I was asked to see this gentleman, I was absolutely full of a cold. I was also very, very busy. And this chap was a patient in the hospice, which is just a stone's throw. It's a walk away from the hospital. But I had known him as an outpatient. He was a gentleman who had lymphoma, and he was a man's man. He was a big man, and he came along first of all for shoulder massage, and I would incorporate therapeutic touch, and in the end we just did the therapeutic touch. But although he was a man's man, he was lovely. He was a gentle giant, if you like, and he had chemo after chemo, as people do, and with lymphoma, and eventually there was no more treatment for him, and weeks passed and he found himself in the hospice. And I got a message asking if I would go over and see him, which I did. And the reason I mentioned that I wasn't feeling very well was because I rushed over. I wasn't particularly focusing. I was going there with one particular purpose in mind, which was to give him healing or therapeutic touch. So when I arrived and his daughter was sat by the bed, I said hello to her, obviously, etc., but I didn't take a lot of notice of her. So my intention was not directed at the daughter. And I spoke to to this gentleman who was drifting in and out of consciousness. He wasn't unconscious, but he was sort of sleeping, I suppose. And he indicated that he knew I was there, and that it was obvious that he was happy for me to carry on. So I did therapeutic touch for as long as it needed. And one of the things I have found and learnt with therapeutic touch is that there is no set length of time, and that quite often it only takes about 10 or 15 minutes. And I know when we're taught Reiki and we're taught some spiritual healing, it can take a lot longer, and it can do. But my experience with therapeutic touch is that there's a sense when it's sort of has started, when it's kicked in, if you like, and there's a sense when it's finished. And sometimes that can be 7 minutes, sometimes it can be 20 minutes. And certainly we're taught that if somebody is quite frail and poorly, then we would do it for a very short length of time. We would deliberately shorten the length of time that we would do it. Anyway, I carried on for however long it took, and he fell into a sleep. When I'd finished, I looked up. His daughter moved slightly away. She was sitting on a chair, and she'd moved slightly back. And I looked at her, and the expression on her face, it was, in some ways, I wish I could package it and sell it, because it was as though every worry, she didn't have many lines, but if she had, her face would have been ironed. She just looked peaceful. Any worry that had been there had gone. Her face, just as I say, it looked as though it had been smoothed out. And she just looked at me and she just said, "It's a far-reaching thing." And that has stayed with me it's informed me so that when I do work with patients, I'm aware that if there are relatives in the room, that it will touch them. And it's also a reminder that how special healing is. Because certainly when you work in an environment that I've been working in, a hospital, which is busy, people are rushing around, it's noisy, phones are going, one is busy, one's going from one person to another. You never quite know what you're going to deal with next. And you see a lot of people. And it's very easy to get complacent and to forget what I would call the sanctity that there is, I feel, within the essence of what we call healing. So that was, let's call him Bob. I don't know why, but let's call him Bob. Another time that the sense of it being far-reaching was a lady who, and I'll tell you a little bit about her, then I'll probably come back to her at the end. But she was a lady who had breast cancer, and she had been a patient for a while, and she'd actually gone on holiday to Cornwall, but had been quite poorly, and we'd had to get an ambulance to bring her back to the hospital. And consequently, her children were still in Cornwall. And she was admitted over the weekend. And I arrived at work on the Monday morning, and the nurses came down specially to ask me if I would go to see her because she was very agitated. So off I went, and she was having difficulty breathing, so she was very agitated and she was sitting up. And I found that I was working very much on her back. Not the whole body, just the back. And I wonder if that is something to do with the heart chakra. Because it doesn't matter whether it's the back or the front, because energy is fluid. She did settle a little bit. Her husband, who I hadn't met, they were estranged, therefore I hadn't met him, and he seemed quite happy to go and get a coffee while I was in the room. And I think that in itself is interesting, because, you know, he'd never met me. I'm walking the room, I start moving my hands a few inches from his wife's body. I mean, it could be some mad woman, couldn't it? If you're not used to healing. And it may or may not have helped. I don't know. She obviously also had medication to help to calm her. So I'm in no way saying that what I did influenced her at all. She died that afternoon. But when I left work that day at about 5 o'clock, it was a summer's evening, and coming across the car park were her family. It was pretty obvious that they were. I just knew they were the family, and they came, and I think that must have somebody who knew me must have been there, and they came over and spoke to me, and they thanked me, and they were obviously so pleased that she'd had this healing. Now, I don't know whether what I did made any difference, but they felt it did. And they were not people that were familiar with healing. And that to me is fascinating, because why is it, I wonder, that when people are at that time of dying and their family are in that space when they know that their loved one is dying, and probably all of us in this room have been there at some point, there is a sense of almost translucency, almost of hyper-awareness, but also as though one is slightly on a different plane. And I just wonder if, looking back to Celtic mythology, if you like, that space between, that sort of veil between life and death. And I just wonder whether we tread very carefully and lightly in that space when we are, whether physically or emotionally, close to somebody who is at that time of passing. Because that to me would make sense as to why people would accept this very strange phenomenon of healing at a time when probably they would think it was a bit bizarre if they weren't familiar with it. And I think that probably brings me to another story of working with a lady who was dying, sort of in the same vein, if you like. And this was a lady who I had only seen once, probably, as an outpatient, so I didn't know her very well. Another lady with breast cancer. She'd got secondaries in her lung, and she was quite young, she was in her 40s, and she'd deteriorated quite rapidly and was admitted. And again, because she wasn't breathing comfortably, she was agitated. And I was asked by the nurse specialist, who is a particular nurse specialist, who's now a great friend, and I think has gradually come round to thinking the way that we do. But at the time, well, when I first met her, she was a little bit sceptical about what I was doing. But as time went by, she would come to me in situations like I've described and say, "Annie, can you just come and see this lady, see if you can help?"
What painkillers and sedation can do in these situations. It may be that it's healing, or the other complementary therapies that are relaxing and calming. It may be that if they're used before, that there might be less need for painkillers, sedation, but I would never ever suggest that either the healing therapeutic touch was the only factor in bringing about a sense of peace or calm or reducing the pain. And I know when I first started out, I thought it might be, and I really asked if I start. Anyhow, I'm forced to go and see this lady, and I walked into a single room, and this lady was, we could call her Diane. She was quite agitated. The family were around, and they were doing their best to calm things, and they'd got some music. But it wasn't the calm music. It was relaxation music they'd found, but it was actually quite fast. And they'd got her, she was hot, this lady, Diane. And they'd got a large fan like you have in hospital by a bed. And they were holding this to try and keep her cool. So the whole room was frantic, if you like. And they looked at me, and I just knew they thought that I was going to work some sort of charm, and that this lady would stop being agitated and the whole room would be calm. And I thought, well, there's no pressure there, is there? It's actually what I thought. So I started to do some therapeutic touch. Again, I found quite interestingly that my hands just wanted to work. We were quite happy working on this lady's back. There was no need for them to go all the way down the body, which normally we would do. And I was also very conscious that I had to stay centred, and that I had to try and distract myself from the need to be seen to do something. I suppose you might call that ego. Suddenly, I was overtaken in the moment, if you like, because my hand, which was halfway down the upper spine, suddenly, it was as though there was a vacuum pulling energy in, not out, but in. My hand was just almost being sucked in. And I thought, as one does, I wonder what's going on here. And just stay with it, and see what happens, and trust. So I waited, and after what seemed like 5 minutes, it subsided. So I just finished up. And I stopped, and the family decided that they would go and get coffee. And they asked me when I would come back. I think Diane was settled a little bit. And I thought this was a good opportunity to go and find some more peaceful music. And I also wanted to get some essential oils. If I was working with people who were coming to the end of life, I would use mostly rose oil, real rose oil. Sometimes with neroli. Rose because it's a very spiritual oil, and neroli because it is calming, but it also, anecdotally, is said to take away fear. But mostly it would be rose. And because the rose I used was already slightly diluted, I would just rub it in my hands, so that it was on my hands. Because, as I say, working in a hospital, it's busy, and I'd got phone calls to make, and as I walked along the ward, there was a patient I noticed who was one of my patients, and I thought, oh, I'll just pop in and see her? I thought, no, I won't. I went down to my office, thought, I'm not going to make any phone calls. And I felt so peaceful. It was almost sublime. And I was totally focused on the fact that I would be going back to this woman. And I have once or twice in my life, when I personally have been close to death, not be personally close to death, but I've been with people close to me, or I've had an experience of my own to do with somebody being close to death. Had a very similar feeling, but very, very rarely. And I collected my tools, if you like, my oils and my music, and I went back up to the ward and bumped into the doctor, who said, please do go in. But Diane's parents had arrived, and they were quite an elderly couple, I suppose, very quiet, and they were obviously unsure of me. So I was torn between what the family wanted, as in daughters, and what the parents wanted, and the husband. So I said to the parents, well, can I just, is it all right? Just stop, and if you're not happy, then I'll go. So I started, I played some quiet music, got the bows at my hands, and the parents sat there and I could see them gradually relaxing. They were sitting quite a long way from, well, they were sitting beside her, but they weren't touching her. And I started again. She was lying back now on the bed, and I started to move my hands. And those of you that are involved with healing probably know that generally we work from the head down. But I found that my hands were going up at night. Possibly, and I just offer this as an idea, possibly working with the crown chakra. I don't know, just an idea. Something that occurred to me was that it was almost like the opposite of birthing. A few weeks previously, I'd had the privilege of being present at my grandson's birth. And so, in a way, it reminded me it was almost an opposite. And I'm not suggesting that I was seeing this lady out at all. Please, not at all. It just seemed that the energy was such, it was going in a different direction. Therefore, it was natural that my hands would be moving in a different direction. And it was almost as though they were doing a dance. Sometimes they would come down. There was no like this, or there was no lingering. It was just moving with the energy that I could sense, and being very present in the moment, you know. I noticed very much that the parents, the mother in particular, was still not touching her daughter. And of course I thought, well, she should be touching the daughter. And I thought, no, don't say anything, just let it, it's not for me to dictate what they should be doing. And carried on. And Diane became very, very peaceful. And it took me a while to realise that she had died, because it was such a gentle transition. And as, again, those of you that have been with people who are dying, you probably know that sometimes the breath seems to stop, and then after a while it comes back again. And that began to happen. And the mother looked at me and was saying, has she died? And I was not quite sure. So we carried on. And it was the mother that realised that she died. I realised that she was almost dying, almost had died, and it was the mother that knew. And interestingly, by the time that had happened, the mother had a hand on the daughter's hand. So the Diane got oxygen, etc., and I took that off, and I thought, again, I mean, I was a nurse, but it took a long time since I'd been nursing clinically. It wasn't my remit as a complementary therapy, as a counsellor, to interfere with drips and oxygen, but I did take the oxygen out, and was greatly relieved at that very moment, within a few minutes of the death, etc. The door opened and the rest of the family came in, and the nurse came in as well. And they thanked me profusely. And again, I find that fascinating, because they didn't know me. They just knew that she'd been to see me as an outpatient. And in fact, she'd been counselling. She hadn't been for healing or therapeutic touch. And again, it's that sense of some sort of innate acceptance and understanding of what is such a very old way of working, if you like, with energy, a very old way of communicating. And I think a very old way of being with the dying. And it is about being with. And I suspect that even if one hadn't been using hands with the energy, the very fact that one was there energetically, if you like, with one's consciousness open and with one's intention just directed to be part of that moment, I think that probably there would have been that change in the room. It's a similar way to how we know some doctors have a good bedside manner, some don't. But if you have you can go into a shop and have a problem over something you've purchased. You might want to return something. And if somebody's awkward and difficult with you, you feel very defensive. But if somebody's understanding and kind, you open up. And I suppose that those are perhaps analogies, if you like, extreme but similar. So I have this great respect for I hesitate to use the word power, but the depth and the intensity of a healing experience. With therapeutic touch, we don't necessarily talk about channeling. I think nowadays healing, probably, that umbrella term, encompasses a variety of approaches. It may mean that people work in a way that they channel a universal energy or chi. Some people may work through guides or angels. But with therapeutic touch, there is a sense that we're connecting with universal energy. But as I said earlier, it's also about a sense of resonance and becoming or hoping to be rather like a template upon which the patient, that their energy field, if you like, can resonate with, so that their own innate and inner sense or inner movement towards wholeness, equilibrium, balance can occur. That might be physical. I've never really felt of it as being physical, but certainly on an emotional, psychological, spiritual level, whatever we mean by spiritual. And with therapeutic touch, there are phases. And I mean, I'm not here to teach you therapeutic touch, but the first phases, so I'm going to do this very briefly, are to do with centering. But before we center, we have to be aware of our intention. And as I said earlier, our intention is to help in a way which is right for that person at that particular time. And we often describe it as being a sense of, I was going to say non-compassionate, compassionate non-attachment. Or I put that down, compassionate. Both connect. Compassionate non-attachment. To the outcome. And compassion has to be part of central and intention. And compassion, the root of the word compassion, has to do with connecting with other human beings, with other people. It's about being connected with the world around us. Having a love for, if you like. Passion being, really meaning love. And in order to centre, what we tend to do is often using our breath, but being in the moment, finding that place within where there is a sense of peace. A way I often describe it, and people have different ways of finding their centre, but a way I often describe it is finding that space between the in-breath and the out-breath, sort of here. It's almost that space when there's no breath, when we switch from breathing in and breathing out, and going deep within, sort of, I suppose, the solar plexus area, this sort of lid on, and just sinking into that space and feeling a sense of calm. Certainly a sense of rootedness as well, but it's more a sense of being inwardly aware, but at the same time completely aware of what's happening around us. And letting our consciousness, our energy, if you like, our consciousness be open and expansive. And allowing that consciousness to be informed and nurtured and nourished by our intention. And then that intention is fed and nourished and guided and nurtured by that sense of compassion, but without an attachment to the outcome, other than that it will be helpful and right for that person. So before we start doing the hand movements, if you like, we have centred and we become aware of our intention. And with the hand movement, somebody once described the hand movements as being a meditation that was in time with that expanded consciousness. And when we move our hands, we often feel different patterns in energy, and we would work with those different patterns. And it's not my remit here to talk about how we would do that, but it is part of the process of therapeutic touch. But it doesn't have to be, because sometimes all we need to do is just, with our centeredness and our intention, let our hands flow and let that intention and compassion be communicated through our hands, through that meditative state, if you like. I don't know whether that makes any sense or not. So that is a little bit about therapeutic touch and what's the process of it, if you like. Now, I've talked about using it with people who are dying, but it can be used, and certainly we used it in all sorts of other situations. A lady that I could think of simply came to therapeutic touch because she found it gave her 3 or 4 days when she wasn't feeling stressed. And she was a lady, she actually had ovarian cancer, and she knew that she wouldn't get better. And she'd got young children, and she wanted them to remember her as an unstressed mother. And she didn't have a lot of support, so looking after these young children sometimes, especially when she was poorly or had had chemo, was quite demanding. And she simply came so that she would get 3 or 4 days of respite from feeling stressed, so that would help her children. There was somebody who came along, and he described himself as being very sceptical, but nothing else was left to him, so he thought he might as well give it a try. And he was quite surprised. He found, the way he described it was, that it gave him a great sense of resolve to carry on. Because as you probably know, sometimes people have chemo, then they have more chemo, they have more chemo, and just to have that next session of chemo requires a huge amount of strength. And he said it gave him the resolve to carry on. And again, that's, I think, part of the narrative, if you like, of healing. I think it's part of the discourse, what it means to different people. It can also be very cathartic, and I have experienced people who, after 2 or 3 sessions, have shared experiences that, for them, may have been in the past, but were quite traumatic. That happens in a counselling session as well. But it's interesting, I think, that it happens without the counselling, with the therapeutic touch. We know that there's a relaxation response with healing, or there can be. So it may well be that that's part of a release process. But it's also something to do with the trust that is there within that space, that people feel they can share things. I can think of people who've remembered experiences from the Second World War. I can think of a lady who shared an experience of she had a brother who was murdered. And interestingly, this particular lady who shared that experience used to come. She came originally because I was asked to see her when she was given news that her cancer had recurred, and she was very, very anxious and beside herself. And I used therapeutic touch just to bring the energy down, if you like. And she found it helpful, so she came to see me quite regularly. She hardly ever spoke about anything. And then one day, she came out with this story completely out of the blue about her brother who'd been murdered. And she was a really beautiful woman, quite young, and she had 2 small children. And like a lot of healthcare professionals, I very rarely go to people's funerals, but I did go to this lady's funeral. And as I left, her mother came up to me and thanked me and said how much this lady had got from coming to the sessions. And at the time, I had this going back a few years, was a CD. It wasn't a CD, it was a tape. CD came afterwards. I had a CD of me talking through a visualisation. So when this lady she died at home. When this lady was dying, and there came a point when she was quite frightened, they played this tape with my voice because they felt it would calm her down, which I think is another example of the far-reaching effect. So that is probably, I'm trying to think if there are other stories about people where I think, oh, that's right, it's the catharsis, the gentleman. A lovely, lovely gentleman. And Tim will understand what I mean. He was a real old suffer boy. Right? So you'll be with me. He was a farmer, and he had lung cancer, and he was a heavy smoker. And his nurse specialist, because he was anxious, suggested that he came to see me. He didn't want to come, but, and as was quite often the case, if somebody was in that hospital setting, if somebody was referred, they would come. They'd think it must be something I'm supposed to do. Not everybody. And at this point, when I think of it, I must say that everything I describe may not be the same for every patient. Some patients aren't interested, and I have no idea. I'm only talking about the patients that have either fed back to me that it was a helpful experience, and the information was gathered through an audit that we did at questionnaires, or my own experience of the experience. This chap came, I'm here because we told to be here. It's fine, but I'm fine. I'm a worrier, he said. My friends say that I'm worrying myself to death. But, you know, I'm all right, really. And I said, well, would you like me to do this therapeutic touch that we've talked about? Yes, he said, would. So he lay down on the couch. Off I did. There wasn't I could see his breathing slowing down. I don't know that something had happened, but it wasn't anything spectacular. There wasn't a deep sentiment. But when we finished, he sat up and he said, well, he said, that was fine. He said, that was all very well. Thank you very much, but I don't feel any different. Okay. And then he started to talk to me about his worries and shared quite a few of his concerns. And I thought, well, that's interesting. You know, he's absolutely fine, but it hadn't had any effect on him that he's talking about his worries. So off he went. And I made an appointment to see him the following week, or possibly a week, fortnight later, I'm not sure. And again, you need to imagine a busy outpatient department. And I saw him at the reception desk, checking in, and he saw me. And he called me over and he said in a very, very loud voice, he said, I don't know what you did to me, whether you cured me or damn near killed me. And I thought, oh dear, we're in the middle of a waiting room. I better take him somewhere quiet. And I felt quite worried. I thought, oh dear, what have I gone and done? And he said to me, that the night after he'd seen me, he said he'd had a night from hell. He said all my demons came to pester me. He said he felt terrible. So I thought, okay, what am I going to do with this information? So I said, well, how did you feel in the morning? He said, bloody tired. I said, all right. I said, well, after you had a sleep, how did you feel? A lot better, he said. He said, I feel as though I'm not frightened anymore. And he was reasonably calm, but she was really quite hysterical. And again, I was asked if I would see her. And I think it's interesting that you've probably noticed that quite often in a crisis situation, they send for me. And I don't think it wasn't me they sent for, it was what I could do. And somebody else could have done the same thing. And I did very much with her, just calmed her down as best as I could. And she settled a bit and went home. I got a phone call that evening from the ward. Her husband had phoned the ward in a state because his wife was in a state. And she was apparently in the corner of a room and very, very distressed. And as you can imagine, I was very, very worried, and in fact I phoned the GP to pass on my concerns because she seemed to be in quite a state. So I left it with the GP, who just said he would wait to see if the husband phoned. So we passed on all that information. In the morning, I phoned to see how she was. And the husband said to me, oh no, she's all right. She had an hour or two of being really, really distressed. And he said, the thing is that years ago we lost a child, and she never really grieved for that child. And it was as though she'd actually brought some of that grief out. And the interesting thing is that she was a lady who, because of her reaction at the time of the bad news, there was an assumption that she wouldn't cope with the husband's journey. But in fact, she coped amazingly. And again, it's another example, I think, of how careful we have to be as well. And being aware that there can be that release. And fortunately, the ones I know of have resolved themselves. But I do think it reminds us to be very cautious and very careful. Are there any questions?
Yes, I wanted to ask about when someone was dying and they stop breathing and then they come back again. Because I've witnessed that actually. Well, what happens then?
It's, Tim will answer better than I, because this is a clinical condition or process to do with oxygen and carbon dioxide, isn't that right?
I believe so. We talked about chain therapy.
I think so, yes.
So it's part of the respiratory section of the brain shutting down.
Yeah. It's a clinical physical process.
Right, yes. So it's difficult to actually see the moments of death.
Yes, there are times you think
Yes.
it's happened.
Yes.
And then people take another breath.
Yes.
I was actually, I work in the hospice at Hampstead,
Yeah.
and I was actually in a patient's room just a few minutes before he was dying. He had a load of visitors in there. He was actually quite a well-known actor, comedian. He had never married, but he had 3 women who all claimed his wife. Yes. And all his girlfriends, and one of them was screaming hysterically because he had, he was in his last few minutes. So I came into the room and I held his hand. What it was, I don't know, but she immediately stopped screaming. And everything went very quiet as he passed. I was just gently touching his hand. I hadn't given him any treatment, any healing or anything at that stage, but I could just tell that the breath was leaving his body. But what really shocked me was, they sent me in there and said, for God's sake, do something with that woman.
Yeah.
And as soon as I went in there and touched the patient, she just suddenly calmed down as if I'd laid my hand on her.
It's fascinating, isn't it? That's why, I don't, and I say in the book, I don't have the answers, but I don't think we should have an answer. We just know that these things can happen.
I don't think, I agree with you. It's almost like you don't want to know the sex of your baby. We don't really want to know the answer, do we, in a way?
Somebody once, I don't know whether I'll get the quote quite right, and she was writing and researching about therapeutic touch, and she said, rather like the butterfly, if we pin it down, we lose it. We lose its essence. And I think, there is a science, as with healing, and nowadays, with therapeutic touch, we tend to put it in a scientific sort of paradigm. We link it with quantum physics and energy. But even if we can use that as an explanation, it doesn't give us all the answers, just the science doesn't give all the answers. If you bear with me for a minute, there's a piece I'd like to read I was very organised, but being me, I am but not be you. Because it's a very interesting, it's not about attacking. It's, I've written it down, I'm going to be really, no, disorganised here. Bear with me for a minute. Here we go. Fingernail island. We can edit this bit, can't we?
Yeah.
I called him Simon. And Simon was about 33 years old and was trying to adjust to life, work and love, following a bone marrow transplant for lymphoma. This can be a lonely journey for anyone, and Simon, feeling he was just starting out on his life, understandably had a multitude of conflicting and painful thoughts and fears going through his mind. Facing and experiencing the bone marrow transplant in itself, as an intervention, is one which demands the finding of an inner strength that most of us never need to access. And Simon came regularly for therapeutic touch. And this is, as I say, we did an audit, and a lot of these accounts from patients are from an audit that we did. And Simon described one particular session, and I quote from what he wrote. "First, I feel I need to state that I'm a male with a leaning towards engineering." And you need to imagine him, this is what his experience is, he's having therapeutic touch or healing. "All of a sudden, I stop thinking of these things on my mind, and I become aware of a gentle pulse in my head. There is a strange divergence in myself. I feel myself relax, but there is a small part of me. There's a small part of myself which is witness to this change. It doesn't think about previous concerns, it just observes what is happening to my body and mind. I am aware of my body and mind becoming more relaxed, like being in a deep sleep. Then, Annie asks me slowly to come back. I try, but a sudden emotion, all the fear and worry of the cancer coming back, seems to leap out of nowhere. Then it is gone. I feel very weak or relaxed. I can't tell. I try to explain that it was the fear and worrying that seemed to come out of nowhere and then was released in some strange way. I think that statement is probably all we need is evidence that something happens with healing. I'd like to end with, if you remember the lady I spoke about, whose family had been in Cornwall and who died. And she's one of those people that I don't forget, because for a couple of reasons. Partly because when she first came to see me, she'd had chemotherapy, she'd had steroids. Excuse me now. Yeah. And it was a hot summer. And as with a lot of patients who have had steroids and chemo, she'd put on a lot of weight. I didn't know that. She just looked like a large lady. She'd lost her hair. And because it was hot, she was quite sweaty. And we talked a bit and did some therapeutic touch. And after a while, she was admitted to the ward. And I saw her on the ward. And she was very keen to show me some photographs of herself. And she showed me a photograph in particular of the day that she'd had out with her family, a few days before she'd been diagnosed. And the impression I got was so different to the impression I got from this woman that I met. She, in the photograph, she was strikingly attractive. The assumptions one would make would be that she was a really sort of, I don't know, busy, go-ahead, mother, businesswoman, which she was. And it was so different to the drug-induced physical representation that she presented. And I spoke to her about it, and I said it must be very difficult. And she said it's particularly difficult with the nurses on the ward, particularly the young ones, because they don't see who I am. They just see the illness and what the drugs have done to me. They have no idea who I really am. And that really brought it home to me, how we make assumptions and how even if someone's appearance hasn't been changed very much, we still don't know their personality as it was before they had the pressures and strains of a diagnosis that is life-changing. And the other reason that I remember Diane, is there was a place in Cornwall that she loved. It might have been Perrin. I'm not sure where it was. But there was a place in Cornwall or Devon that she loved. And she was very keen to go there with her family for one last time. And she was poorly, but the consultant that was in charge of her and her nurse specialist made it possible for her to go. And off she went, and she sent a postcard. Now, this postcard had pictures of the place that she was in. And it wasn't sent to me, but it was shared with me, because I was part of the people that had been involved with her. So I'd like to feel that the words that she said were partly for the doctor, the consultant, partly for her nurse specialist, and partly for, not for me, but for the healing that I've been able to give me. And what she said, or words to this effect, was, she said, it may not be heaven, if I can spell that, it may not be heaven, but it feels like it. And of course she was thanking the team that looked after her for enabling her to spend some time in this place. And as I say, it wasn't particularly directed at me, but I like to feel that the whole experience, to me, it links in with what I hope she felt when she experienced therapeutic touch. And I think I probably talked enough, although it's not quite 9 o'clock. I can carry on.
There may be some space for a question and answer to think.
And I can read that to the else.
I thought the therapeutic touch is another way of describing quantum touch, which is a course that I did where I'm an NFSH healer and we work in the energy field.
Yeah.
But I also did this quantum touch course, and there you place your hands on the physical body, and with breathing in a certain way, vibration goes to where it's meant to go. It's interesting.
To the best of my knowledge, therapeutic touch preceded quantum touch.
Into it. Yes.
But again, to the best of my knowledge, it was therapeutic touch which suggested the framework of quantum physics for energy work.
Yes.
And when I say energy work, I'm thinking in terms of healing being energy work, although how we define energy is questionable as well.
Yes.
But, so to the best of my knowledge, quantum physics comes after therapeutic touch. And the way you described it, obviously it's a different modus operandi.
Yes.
Therapeutic touch.
Yes.
I have, and again it's just a personal thing, I think we can complicate matters. I think that, to me, energy work or healing is quite simple, and I think that and I leave Reiki to one side because I've studied Reiki and I know there's some problems with Reiki using the symbols, and I appreciate that. But I think when we're working with energy, once you've actually made that connection, both with whether you are expanding your consciousness and using your intention and centering and becoming part of that space, so that all within that space are affected by that change in vibration. I'm not convinced that we need to do a lot of complicated things. But I don't know.
I'm quite rather interested in this word intention, because I'm a very tired nurse and I used to work at the Royal Free, and I'd had a most terrible afternoon and evening working as a research sister and then changing and working on wards, and it was very understaffed. And then I got out of the hospital and my car had been vandalised, so I cried all the way home to St James's. And the next day I went off to St James's Piccadilly, when I worked with, we used to go to this monthly workshop that the Sufi healing order were giving, and Peter Dewey, a priest, was doing a workshop there, and he took an interest in me and he said, I told him about this evening, and he said, well, Jill, all you have to do is to surround your patients in light. Well, that's a thought and an intention, and for seriously ill people, I used to just wash them and visualize them in light. And I think it helped.
Yeah, I think it's all part of the same, and I suppose the light is a vibrational frequency.
Yes.
It is light.
Yes.
As in weight, yes. Yeah.
And I found it worked, and actually not even washing patients, is there was something happening. I would just put light there, and it all subsided. It was quite extraordinary. I thought, well, this is really extraordinary.
And of course, if it's coming from you, you too.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. It's interesting. In the book, you just reminded me about how we look after ourselves.
Yes.
And in the book, I have a chapter about how to look after ideas, suggestions for looking after ourselves. And also a chapter on what I call therapeutic communication, because in the healing session, we're not counselling as such, but often the conversation is one where we need to understand communication in order to listen and hear, respond appropriately, and actually know our own boundaries, which is quite difficult when we just talked about being open. So I've put in a chapter there about communication, about understanding that it's not for us to rescue everybody.
Yes.
I hear the terminology healing hands used a lot. What, if anything, is the difference between that and therapeutic hands?
Well, I suppose healing hands is often a
One of my exes portrayed to having.
Yeah,
She's
it's
got
a very generic.
She's got heat coming out of her hands.
Yeah. I think it's. I earlier was saying that I think there is the one healing, and that there are different.
Sorry, I might miss that.
Yeah. There are different models, and there are many people who feel that healing is something which is innate in all of us. It's there.
She used to say it's spiritual.
Yeah. And I think with some, this is again my personal view, I think with some people that innate ability to heal, whatever we mean by that, is more to the surface, it's more accessible. And I think the term healing hands must be a very old generic term, I think, for people who perhaps have...
I think it goes back to the Bible, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, and possibly before. I think way back in Egyptian times, there are mentions of it in old documents that go back more thousands of years than the Bibles. And I think, yeah, healing hands is just a very generic expression for people who have that ability, but perhaps it's closer to the surface than with other people. And either will find its own natural direction or encourages people to go and learn a little bit so they can use that ability in a way that is helpful to them and to other people.
So therapeutic hands don't give off heat or anything like that?
Well, therapeutic touch is a name for a model of healing,
Right.
a type of healing. So people who practice therapeutic touch may well have
All right.
healing hands.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't call them therapeutic hands,
Right.
but they may come under the group of people who might be described as having healing hands. Yeah. And their hands may get hot. Sometimes with working with healing and energy, one can actually feel very cold energy. Some of those hands can be very cold as well as very cold.
I suppose it's a question of whether things are going in, like you were describing, your hand going close to like being sucked in, by a vacuum.
Well, yeah, it wasn't the hand, it was a shh.
It was the energy thing, and you may need to put energy in. You may be channeling energy in, if you want to call it channeling energy in, or you may be actually drawing energy out.
No, but I think, I've asked various people, and I think that's some sort of, almost like emerging, because the sense of calm and tranquility that I had was amazing. And I think why anything had been shut in, I don't know. People have given me various explanations, sometimes to do with how from an energy aspect, the body works when it's beginning to fade. I don't know enough about these things.
I actually called my website Healing Hands.
Yes.
It just came to me.
Yeah?
But I remember as a child, my mother was a fantastic nurse. She wasn't very nice to me most of the time unless I was ill. But I just remember the way she used to touch me. And she told me, she said that her mother had healing hands. I said, what do you mean by that? And she said it's just the way the ability she had to make people feel better. And, if you have a child and they fall over, automatically want to rub it better.
Touch is one of the oldest ways of both communicating and comforting.
And I just like this kind of timeless quality of it. Through the centuries, people have had to, particularly women, if I may say, have had what they call healing hands. It's just a link to the past.
I think so.
Because the art of healing is as old as the world.
Absolutely.
If you know it. When people developed on Earth, that's when healing happened. They must have had rituals.
Absolutely. I have an idea, and I think I mentioned this in the book, that way back, when we particularly, when we lived in tribes and small communities and we needed to protect each other and preserve each other because we needed the numbers, unlike today, but we needed the numbers. If somebody was physically wounded, then I just wondered whether it was that intention and need to help that somehow or other generated something which became what we call healing. And I think the same would apply with what I think you're saying about the comfort of healing hands. It's something so deeply innate within us that if it's meant, it's communicated.
I would agree absolutely with your take on it, that it's something which is innate in all of us, but like a lot of things, some people have got a natural, it's there already. And my daughter had the same experience of her hands when she was doing, as a young teenager, doing a Saturday job in the chemist just behind the counter.
Yeah.
If someone came in who was obviously ill, her hands would just turn into like heaters, like, you know, someone had switched on a sort of bar heater, and they were just unbearably hot, you know.
I also think that different healers have different things that they connect with. I mean, much to my surprise, I never actually planned to have this career pathway. It wasn't on my sort of trajectory, my mind at all. It's a complete shock to me. And going into nursing was it wasn't a planned thing, it was synchronicity. I mean, there's another story in that altogether. But I have found myself working with people emotionally, if you like, and that seems natural to me. We all know people who have worked with people with physical conditions have reported that there have been improvements. And who knows, if we're talking about energy, if we're talking about the future, and we think about what MRI scanners can do with energy and the way they can interpret it, but it's magnetic resonance, isn't it? You do wonder what actually we will do in the future by using our consciousness. And I think we ought to be exploring that.
Well, tests have proved when 50-50 had placebos for real drugs, and they've had as much recovery from placebos as they had because they taking the drugs.
Yeah, I agree, and I think certainly in the world of complementary therapies and healing and energy work, etc., the idea that placebo almost means that
psychosomatic.
It's what you've done hasn't worked, without acknowledging that what the patient's done on their own has. So it's interesting. There's a lot. I think there's a lot that could be explored and looked into. But because we're still on the edges of the medical world, if you like.
Well, there's still a lot they don't know that the brain does, isn't there? There's still an awful lot that they don't know. So
yeah, absolutely.
I think we only know about 1/10 of what the brain does, isn't it?
Yeah.
I do like the neutrality of your calling it therapies a touch. It's a very neutral term. Even when I started at hospice 7 odd years ago, I was remonstrated with. I wasn't working as ER. They said they wanted me to do reflexology, so I said, okay, put in this. And a senior nurse actually came to me and said, I had been overheard having a conversation with a patient and I mentioned the word healing. I was just so embarrassed, I didn't know where to put myself. That has gone out of the window before us. You know, we now have Reiki healers, spiritual healers, everything at hospice, but, you know, they were a bit slow to come, you know, into the modern way of thinking. But when you, basically, it's a fear that we're going to try and convert people, that we're going to give people false hope. If you're a professional person, you don't give people
I think
false hope.
sadly,
If you're a doctor or a nurse or a complementary therapist, it's against your professionalism.
yes. I think sadly there are still people who will give false hope. But I think that and I think probably no doubt, I'm sure what happened with you was probably what happened with me. And I was able to use the term therapeutic touch, and also because it was introduced by nurses, and I just happened to be with a group of very sympathetic nurses at the time. I was able to use it. I don't think I would have been able 20 years ago to have used the word healing. I did introduce it as healing, and we had Reiki as well. But by example, by people seeing the responses, and sometimes by some of the doctors actually trying it out. And I knew they were trying it out to see if anything happened. I didn't shout about it, I just let feedback gradually filter through. All that said, quite often it was called relaxation therapy. Are there any more questions?
I had a couple of quickies, Amy. First of all, is there any continued similar work up at Ipswich?
I hope so. Well, the complementary therapists carried on. They've got Reiki there.
Yeah.
So actually, the service carries on. Yes, it does.
It's much like the experience with Angie's healers. They become, they can't dispense with them. They have to find funding after the original funding runs out.
It seems to be once, as I said at the beginning, they replaced me with 2 people and they didn't get rid of the service.
No.
Yes, they were very, very keen to keep it.
And the other question was, is therapeutic touch being taught in the UK?
At the moment I'm not teaching it. I have a colleague in the north of England, Karen, who is teaching it, and there is a website, I think it's therapeutictouch.org.uk, but if you Google you'll find it. Or if you want to contact me, I can put you in touch. And she is doing a couple of courses next year. So
I'd like to hear that. I remember going up and meeting Jean Sarah and Steve Wright, and but they've retired, I think.
They've changed direction.
Yeah.
So, but if you don't want to buy, and I feel very embarrassed really saying to buy a book, but if you do want to take these, I shall leave them here, and they give you information about how to contact me. And if you do feel at some time in the future you want to buy a book, or have friends who might want to, then the information is there. Yes, I'm on the quiz, yes. So, one more question.
Yeah, everything that you said, I came a bit late on everything you said while I was here is all relates to people who are dying, right? Now, I mean, how does this apply to people who need some sort of counselling or other, but are not on their last legs? So
I think you came in late because I mentioned several people who found that it was useful for. There was one lady who used it simply to give her a few days when she didn't feel stressed.
Yeah.
Somebody else who used it because it gave him the resolve to carry on through his treatment. I mean, I worked in an environment where people were poorly. There's an oncology department.
Yeah.
But there were a lot of people who came simply because it was relaxing, helped them with anxiety. So it's certainly not just for time.
I mean, the point is this, I mean, you can suffer so much stress and eventually it does have a physical effect, right?
Yeah.
So if you can get this healing or this whatever you're doing before it reaches that stage, I mean, it might save you anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just, it has been used in mental health. It's also used sometimes for therapeutic touch. Has been used with premature babies as well. Helps them to grow. Obviously only very, very short periods of time. And in fact I have colleagues who did use it in neonatal units. Yeah, so it can be used in all sorts of contexts. Yeah. So mother.
Well, the shop is open, eh?
So is that?
Are we your questions finished?